Communication Specialist for the Kentucky Tobacco Prevention and Cessation Program. We have a great lineup for you all today, so I'm just going to share a few announcements before we dive in. First, everyone is in listen-only mode, as you may have noticed, but you can still be involved in the discussion, and we hope that you will be. You can enter questions in the questions box. You can also share comments with us there and let us know what you think of the different presenters that we'll hear from. You can also check the separate chat box for announcements as we go forward. This webinar series would not be possible without our amazing sponsors. Those are UK Healthcare, Kentucky Health Collaborative, the Kentucky Asthma Management Program, and Interact for Health. So please join me in thanking them for their support. We really couldn't do it without them. Next, we want this webinar series to be as interactive as possible, so please join the conversation on social media. You are welcome to tweet about what's going on today or post on any other networks using the hashtag KYTobaccoFree or hashtag ICanEndTheTrend. You can also message us or tag us in pictures, screenshots that you take, quotes that you capture at KY Tobacco Free, which is the Kentucky Tobacco Prevention and Cessation Program, or at KY Smoke Free, which is the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policies. Share what you're learning and let us know your thoughts. So as the webinar begins to wrap up, we hope that you'll stay on the line and fill out our very short, quick evaluation survey. And if you do that, you'll be entered to win a $25 Amazon gift card, which, as we all know, you could use to buy just about anything. So 8 people will be winning one of those, but you have to fill out that evaluation link in order to be entered to win, and we'll be sharing that link after the 3 presentations are finished. So that is my final announcement, which means it's time to get started. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Ellen Hahn, professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Kentucky, and also director of BREATHE, which includes the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy. Dr. Hahn will be our moderator for today. So, Dr. Hahn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ellen. Today we're excited to hear about 2 different approaches to school-based e-cigarette education. First, we will hear about Beyond Nicotine, which is a life science approach from the University of North Carolina. It invites high school science teachers to help students interpret scientific data and evaluate the impact of an e-cigarette flavorings and aerosols on respiratory health. After that, we will hear about hashtag ICanEndTheTrend, a tobacco control approach from the University of Kentucky, featuring a peer-led youth prevention and empowerment program. Finally, we will hear from a Kentucky high school science teacher in Perry County, who will share his own experiences engaging high school students on a variety of topics, as well as e-cigarette education. Our first speakers are Dana Hahn and Elise Hickman from UNC, or the University of North Carolina. Dana is the K-12 Science Education Manager for the Center for Public Engagement with Science. Elise Hickman is a PhD student in toxicology and environmental medicine who trains teachers as part of Beyond Nicotine. Dana and Elise, thank you so much for joining us in Kentucky. Take it away.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Can you see my slide?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, hi, my name is Dana Hahn, and relevant to the conversation today, my background is biology. I'm a former community college biology instructor. And that's really what inspired the work that you're going to be learning about today from UNC Chapel Hill. So I do work for the Center for Public Engagement with Science at the UNC Institute for the Environment. And in that role, one of the hats that I wear is to do science education and outreach for the Center for Environmental Health and Susceptibility out of the Gilling School of Global Public Health. So I get to work closely with researchers like Elise to take the science coming out of the center and translate that to different audiences. And an audience that I work with a lot are K-12 STEM teachers. So I told the team today that I would kind of provide a general introduction to e-cigarettes first, because that is something we do in any of our professional development situations, is we kind of try to make sure everyone's on the same page. And I recognize that some of the people here probably, work in the tobacco control field, you really understand vaping, but there might be some people on the call today who don't know much about vaping. That was the case for me until about 2018. So I'm just going to go through a few introductory slides that we developed for educational purposes with middle and high school students in mind. So first off, there are many different types of e-cigarette devices. And up until 2016, this is what many of those devices looked like. This figure here that you can see is from a Human Health and Services report from the Surgeon General in 2016. But something happened in 2016 after that report was published, and that is Juul hit the marketplace in late 2016. These were very sleek looking e-cigarette devices. Many of you have probably seen these now, but these are where you purchase the flavored cartridges or pods, and that's how you kind of get your hit of nicotine. And we'll talk about what made Juul so special in just a few minutes. Since Juul was released, that really has led to an explosion of other e-cigarette devices, some very sleek, very discreet, and some clearly targeted towards adolescents. So just to put this in context, there are also disposable e-cigarettes now, and these e-cigarettes are exempt from the 2020 flavor ban that went into effect. Juul was really impacted by that 2020 flavor ban. Menthol and tobacco flavors are the only ones that are allowed now in these flavored cartridges or pods. So what this means is that many youth have turned towards these disposable e-cigarette devices, and those flavors are not regulated. So I want to talk a little bit about what is in an e-liquid. This is the liquid that is inside one of these devices. So there's a base liquid, which can be a proprietary blend of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. So both of these are clear liquids. They have a variety of chemical properties, and this is where chemistry teachers in particular can become quite interested in the ingredients of e-liquids. So these impart sweetness to the e-liquids. They help to be a good solvent for the flavorings, and they can also give rise to that large vapor cloud that we see from some vaping devices. And we do have researchers at UNC studying the impact of just these ingredients alone on respiratory health. So these are not necessarily inert ingredients. And then the e-cigarettes could have nicotine or not, and there are two different types of nicotine that might be two different types of nicotine to choose from. Freebase nicotine, and you can see the concentration here on the right, and also nicotine salts. And that is one of the features of Juul and related devices that emerged after Juul that really helped to, I think, propel this kind of e-cigarette trend among adolescents. We'll talk about the chemistry of nicotine salts in just a minute. Actually, we'll do it right now. So the two forms of nicotine, Freebase nicotine, this is the nicotine that's found in tobacco, combustible cigarettes, and also those older generation e-cigarette devices. The pH of Freebase nicotine is basic, and that leads to an irritation in the throat. So what happened with the invention of Juul, which was developed by some graduate students at Stanford University, is they coupled that nicotine with a salt to create a nicotine salt, and that lowered the pH of the nicotine a bit. That leads to a smoother hit to the throat, making it more palatable. And really what this means is that more nicotine can be inhaled without it being irritating to the throat. And so that's particularly concerning from an adolescent standpoint. How much nicotine are we talking about? And it really depends on the e-cigarette liquid that you're choosing. This is a nice figure from the Stanford Tobacco Prevention Toolkit. And if you're not familiar with that resource, I definitely encourage you to check it out. Maybe someone can drop the link into the chat. They have a bunch of resources for educators. And this is where this figure came from. So you can see 1 pack of cigarettes here on the left is equal to about 20 milligrams of nicotine. And then we just have a range of nicotine concentrations. So you can see the Surin pod, for instance, is equivalent to about 90 cigarettes. And some youth and people might go through 1 or 2 of these a day. So that's where this can be really concerning because it can be harder to monitor how much nicotine you're actually getting. And then we have flavors and additives, and you're going to hear from Elise in just a few minutes. She's studying the impact of these flavorings on our respiratory system. So cinnamaldehyde is one flavor in particular that's popular, but also looks to be problematic from a health perspective. Other additives that we're familiar with are THC, supplements like caffeine, for instance. And then another thing we need to be concerned about are contaminants. And we think that contaminants perhaps led to the vaping-related outbreak that we saw in 2019. So vitamin E acetate is one possible contaminant, and we've also detected pesticides in e-liquids. So that's another concern, is you don't always know what you might be inhaling because of the presence of contaminants. All right, so we have complex e-liquids. Hopefully I've kind of convinced you of that. And those of you who teach chemistry, you're probably seeing some connections to your chemistry curriculum. And so when we heat those e-liquids inside the vaping device, you can see the e-liquid here is represented in blue. When we heat that liquid, there's a misconception that it's water vapor that's generated and it's completely harmless. Really what's generated is a complex aerosol. And you can see the definition of an aerosol here on the left. An aerosol is a suspension of solid particles and liquid droplets in air or another gas. So these vape clouds that we see really are a complex aerosol, and we have researchers studying the health effects of inhaling that aerosol and then exhaling it out into the world, where other people could be exposed to that aerosol as well. So that's also being studied. So this leads us to our work. It appears, so this is just a quote from the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering, showed, they found evidence that perhaps e-cigarettes, have less risk associated with health compared to combustible cigarettes. I can't see my full image here. Oh, hold on. But it appears that e-cigarettes may present their own unique health effects to the respiratory and cardiovascular system. And this led us to think more about beyond nicotine. It's not just nicotine addiction that we're concerned about. It's what happens when we are exposed to those other chemicals in the e-liquids, like the flavors, like the nicotine salts, and even those base liquids. So Elise, her mentor is Dr. Ilona Jaspers at UNC Chapel Hill. And it's really meeting Ilona several years ago and learning about her research on vaping that really piqued my interest as a former biology teacher. So this is kind of one of their fundamental research questions here. What are the effects of e-liquids and aerosols derived from e-liquids on the respiratory immune response? And when I heard about the research that they are doing on vaping and the health effects of these e-liquids and aerosols, I saw numerous opportunities to connect this to things that I was asked to teach about when I taught about biology, like mitochondria, for instance, and phagocytosis. There were so many curriculum connections. So that inspired Elise and I to begin working together to develop a series of lessons that I'll tell you about in just a moment. But I wanted to just tell you, one of the hats that I wear with the UNC Chapel Hill is as an environmental health educator, and I have NIEHS funding to do this type of work like I'm doing today. And so e-cigarettes are an environmental health concern, and we can use e-cigarettes to provide the context to teach about these kind of fundamental environmental health concepts. So these are some big ones that I think you can convey to an audience when you're teaching about e-cigarettes. The fact that flavorings are chemicals, e-liquids are complex chemicals, e-cigarette vapor is actually a complex aerosol, small particles in aerosols can be inhaled deeply into the lungs, and these chemicals can be toxic. So there is definitely an environmental health interest when we're talking about e-cigarettes and vaping. And typically, when we think about e-cigarettes and vaping, a lot of people instantly go to the health connections in terms of curricula. So we know, a lot of attention, and this is all rightly so, goes on talking about nicotine addiction. There's marketing and advertising, also policy and regulation. But the approach that we're bringing in through our center is to look at the sciences. So the environmental health field, is really underpinned by research taking place across the sciences, from the biological sciences to the physical sciences. So that's really where we've been working, is trying to bring that science in, and that's enabled us to engage with STEM teachers, kind of getting out of that health classroom. Health classroom is still very important, but taking the message to a new audience that can be really impactful in targeting adolescents who are certainly vulnerable to the health effects of e-cigarettes. So e-cigarettes provide life science students with a relevant context in which to explore and refine what they know about cell structure and function, cellular respiration, and the respiratory system, for instance. And so this is really kind of the hypothesis, if you will, that's driving our curriculum development. And these are just some of the images from our work to engage teachers and students. So our life science approach is really, it's based on recommendations from the latest research on vaping prevention. And there's a website here, vapingprevention.org, which is based out of UNC. But they kind of have compiled research, and they have these 2 recommendations which line up nicely with our approach, which is help you understand what vaping chemicals will do to their bodies, and focus on the respiratory, chemical, and cardiovascular harms of vaping. And that's indeed what we do in our lessons that we've developed. So Elise and I, over the past 2 years now, I guess, we have developed 3 lessons. And we have kind of grouped these together in what we call our Beyond Nicotine lesson series. Each of these lessons are data interpretation activities where students analyze, interpret data, and draw conclusions on the respiratory health effects of e-cigarettes. So not only are we conveying important information about e-cigarettes, but we're also cultivating data literacy among students, which as a former biology educator, I know is very much needed still. These are the 3 lessons, and this is the QR code. If you can capture that, this will take you to our website where you can access each of the lessons. And Elise is going to tell you a little bit more about these and the strategies that we use to work together to develop these lessons in our next presentation. Here's my contact information. I welcome you to email me, those of you on the webinar today who are teachers. Elise and I are happy to support you if you're interested in integrating any of these lessons into your teaching. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Like I was introduced, my name is Elise Hickman, and I'm a 4th-year PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, and my portion of the talk is going to be focused on how we incorporate research into educational activities and sort of the process that Dana and I have gone through together to generate these lessons. So the format for most of our lessons is a jigsaw activity, which for people who aren't familiar involves breaking the students up into groups, and then they each get a section of the data that they interpret and analyze, and then they come back together and share it with the class. So they each get handouts that include the graphs that they're going to analyze, some questions that will guide them through the analysis, and then a worksheet where they can summarize what their group has found, but also what all the other groups have found. And that way they can learn a lot and get familiar with a lot of the data, but we're not giving them the whole set of data from an entire research paper. Our first lesson is focused on evaluating the effects of flavored e-cigarettes on the respiratory immune system, and this is a project that was done by a graduate student in our lab before me, and his project was focused on understanding this question, and we thought that it lent itself really well to being broken up into these 6 different groups. So each student group would get a different set of graphs, like you can see down here in the panel, that they would then analyze. And our next lesson is in a pretty similar format, but it just gets at a slightly different scientific question, evaluating the bioenergetic effects of flavored e-cigarettes on a certain type of respiratory immune cell. And so what lesson teachers might want to use could depend on when you might want to insert this into your curriculum or what sort of concepts you want to reinforce. This lesson is a lot more focused on bioenergetics like mitochondrial function, whereas the previous lesson is more focused on immune cells and their function. And we made both of these lessons before the COVID-19 pandemic, and we knew that we wanted to make this lesson about the effects of e-cigarettes on airway inflammation and asthma, kind of to get at that question about whether people with asthma are more susceptible to e-cigarettes. But we wanted to make something that was really easily adaptable to a virtual classroom. So we learned about this digital interactive notebook format, which we thought was really cool, and what we decided to base our asthma lesson on. And there are a few different parts of this lesson that teachers can pick and choose from to determine if they want to do all 3 parts or if maybe only one part is appropriate for their class. In the first part, students create a model of a healthy and inflamed respiratory tract, and to do this, they do some background reading. We provide them with some links where they can learn about different cell types and the ways that they function, and then they generate that model of a healthy and inflamed respiratory tract using icons that can be clicked and dragged. In the second part, students learn about inflammatory biomarkers, what they do, why they're important, and then that's where the data analysis component comes in, where they get to look at biomarker data for different groups, including vapers, smokers, and non-users, and they compare those biomarkers and draw conclusions about some of the health effects of vaping and smoking. And then in the last part, we have the students design a study to test whether asthmatics are more susceptible to the health effects of e-cigarettes. And the reason we did it this way is actually this is something that we are still investigating in our lab and in some of the labs that we collaborate with. We don't know for sure whether e-cigarettes impact respiratory health more in asthmatics. There's some research that suggests it might, but because we don't really have the data to answer this question, we thought it would be cool to see what the students would design to answer it. And so that's an overview of the 3 different lessons we've put together. And now in this part of the talk, I'm going to go over our lesson development process, which is outlined here. It starts with just Dana and I talking to each other. Then she aligns it to standards, and we work through all the rest of the steps, which we're now going to go over in a little bit more detail. So the first part, which is I think the really fun part, is when we talk to each other, because me as a scientist, I'm not often in the classroom and I don't have that sort of background or expertise. And so I have the ability though to explain the research that we're doing, what we do and don't know. I have access to all of the data from our lab and from the papers that we've published. And because I'm in the nitty-gritty all day, every day doing the science, I'm a good resource for making sure that we're accurately representing everything that we know. Whereas Dana brings to the table that she's an education expert, and so she can look at the research that we do and see how it fits into state and national science education standards, think about what's realistic to do in a classroom and what students will be able to digest. We also work together, and Dana helps with providing relevant background information and resources and making sure that the data that we present is something that students will be able to understand. So this is a really collaborative part of the process, and I think it's really important to do in detail and to make sure everyone's on the same page before going ahead with the lesson development. And showing relevance is really important, showing like why is this research relevant to what students are learning in a biology classroom. And there's this meme that goes around the internet about how the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and that's what people remember from biology class. And here we actually are studying the mitochondria and how it's an important source of ATP and how flavoring chemicals can impact that. So that's just one example of how this research is relevant, but it's something that we have to think about for each of the components, making sure that it's not just cool science, but that it also fits into the curriculum. And one of the most important, probably one of the hardest and most time-consuming parts of this process is making data accessible. So on the left is what data might look like in the paper that we've published from our lab. And you can see that the figure labels are pretty small. Some of it's pretty long. There's usually a lot of jargon involved. And so for all of the figures that we include in our lesson, we relabel them with usually larger fonts. Sometimes we'll change the axes labels to be something a little more straightforward. So rather than J aggregate of JC monomer, we just write ratio of red to green, because to students that can convey the same information as a really detailed label in the paper. And we provide this as a starting place for making the data more accessible, but because it is so time consuming and because it's hard to know the needs of every classroom, we also welcome teachers to modify, relabel, recreate graphs, to change this around as they need to fit what they think their students will find the most useful. We also, below each graph, provide a really detailed description of what the graphs are showing and why that's important. So you can see in this example, we describe what the mitochondrial membrane potential is and why that matters. And then in the second paragraph, describe exactly what experiment was done to make the graphs here and what the outcome of the experiment means. And so we try to provide as much context as we can for showing this data, and we found that that ensures that everyone is able to understand it and interpret it easily. Another important component of the lesson development process is to develop these supporting materials. And these are really important because it gives students and teachers context for how scientists like myself are actually physically performing these experiments. And this is something that when I was in high school and even before I started doing this research, I had no idea what was physically happening in order to make science happen and to get the data that are on the graphs that I was seeing. And so we like to go into a lot of detail describing where the different cells come from that we're using and also how we set up experiments. And this can help reinforce certain concepts around experimental design, like having a control group and what is the purpose of the control group and why might we have certain control groups. Like here we have cells that only get media, cells that just get the PGVG base, and cells that get flavoring chemicals in PGVG. And that way we can tease out what different chemicals are driving the effects. So these supporting materials come as part of the lesson, and they can either be presented to the class by the teacher or they can be reading material, but they give important background before the students experience the data. And then at the end, once we've made the data accessible, developed supporting materials, really put the whole lesson together, we usually have other people review it, like other scientists, but also other education experts. We'll have teachers review it and then eventually have teachers pilot it in their classroom and give us feedback, because when we're making it on our computers, we are doing the best we can, but we don't know how it's really going to be implemented or whether it will be feasible. And so these steps are really important at the end to refine the lesson and make sure that it's a product that will be usable by teachers everywhere. So I want to just provide a quick example of something that we might show when we're presenting this research or presenting the lesson. And this is some data that you'll find in our second lesson about cellular bioenergetics. And this was an experiment performed by Phil Clapp, who was the grad student before me, and he was curious about what would happen when bronchial epithelial cells, and these are cells that line the airways and beat mucus and anything trapped in it up and out of the airways, what happens when they're exposed to cinnamon flavored e-cigarette aerosol. So he took these cells and he exposed them to e-cigarette aerosol and then wanted to see what would happen to their cilia beating. And so this is, hopefully you all can see this video. You should be able to see some movement, and what you're seeing are the cilia beating, and these are healthy cilia. They should be beating pretty quickly, and there should be cilia covering the whole screen. But when Phil exposed these cells to cinnamon flavored e-liquid, you'll see that the cilia slow down a lot. There are a lot fewer cells that are beating, and this is after 10 minutes. But after 40 minutes, you can see that the cilia are almost completely stopped. There's very little movement going on. And this was really interesting to see because after 2 hours, they fully recovered. So just one exposure and then watched them to see what would happen. After 2 hours, they fully recovered. And this is something we still don't fully understand, but we can take these videos of cilia beating and quantify that cilia beating. And that's one of the pieces of data that we show in the lesson in a question such as this. So the students would get to see those videos, and that would hopefully pique their interest in what's going on. And then they can see the quantitative data here as part of the first group's questions, answering whether cinnamon flavored e-liquids and aerosols impair ciliary beating in respiratory epithelial cells. And just to give a little more detail on the structure of the guiding questions, we like to start them off with review questions that recap something that they probably heard in the introductory slides or something that they might have previously learned in classroom material. So why are these things important? What could a consequence be if they don't work? And then as part of the data analysis, they answer some guided questions about what has the most effect, are effects similar in different systems? And so when we piloted this, it's been really cool to see the students analyzing the data and drawing their own conclusions about what might happen if they vape. So we're not just telling them that e-cigarettes are harmful, but we're having them look at the original data themselves and make that decision. And I think that's a really powerful exercise, especially in this COVID times where people understanding science and being able to read the science and decide for themselves is so important and can have such an impact on public health and on people's decision making. So we really found this partnership to be amazing and valuable, a lot of fun, because as a scientist, it helps me get out into the community and see the real impact of my research rather than just publishing it in a journal that only 10 other scientists are going to read. It feels a lot more meaningful to be able to go out into the community and interact with the stakeholders in our research. And on the flip side, partnering with community engagement experts can also increase our research relevance. It can help with science communication skills. I mean, some of the slides that I use for my outreach talks, I also use for my research talks. So it's just a really interesting interplay that we have here. And it makes things more real, relevant, and robust for all of the parties involved. And we see this when we talk to people who have been involved in these partnerships. So my boss, the professor that runs my lab, has said that working with the CEC has improved how she structures her presentations. So similar to me, it's helped with telling a story and just seeing how public health can impact real life stories. On the flip side, biology teachers have told us that e-cigarettes are really relevant and interesting to students and that they really enjoy getting to see the data coming out of our labs.
Thank you so much, Elise. This is fabulous.
Yeah.
You want to? Yeah.
I'll leave this last slide. We just had we did a webinar series where scientists got to interact with a lot of different teachers, and teachers got to interact with scientists, and that was a great event that we had.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to both Dana and Elise. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Melinda Ngss and Sierra Miley from UK. Dr. Ngss is an associate professor of health promotion in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Promotion and the program director of #I Can End the Trend. Sierra is the program coordinator and co-creator of #I Can End the Trend. So take it away, Mindy and Sierra.
Okay, thank you. If you all could give Sierra access to share her screen, that would be great. Well, we get this up and running. So we're really excited to talk a little bit about our #I Can End the Trend program. And as a health promotion professor, I'm really always trying to think about ways that we can connect health education in schools and in the community, but also how can we engage our young people and empower them to want to make a difference with this issue, specifically being e-cigarette use. So through the success we've had with education, availability of tobacco treatment, and policy changes, we've seen commercial tobacco use decrease in popularity. So yay, high five to everybody that's helped with that. But unfortunately, the same luring tactics that the tobacco companies used years ago are being repeated, which has contributed to the surge in e-cigarette use among our youth and emerging adults. And you can see a graph there depicting some of those recent statistics. So according to the CDC, we know that in 2020, about 1 in 5 high school students were using e-cigarettes. And unfortunately in Kentucky, we tend to see higher trends than the national average when it comes to tobacco use. And so this coincides with the surge in use of e-cigarettes among our youth and young adults. The latest data we have, it reports that about 26.1% of Kentucky high school students reported current e-cigarette use. So we asked ourselves, what can we do to help change this trend? So in 2019, our peer-led I Can End the Trend program was developed in collaboration with college students to really tackle this issue in a way that connects with youth and young people on their level and in ways that are meaningful to them. And so the primary goal of I Can End the Trend is to provide evidence-informed tobacco use prevention to youth, families, and community members across Kentucky. And our program really helps build awareness on the dangers of tobacco use, including e-cigarettes, the costs associated with nicotine dependence, and then the ways youth have been targeted and influenced by these companies that sell these products. So most importantly, and I think the thing that I love most about our program is we strive to empower younger generations to end the trend of e-cigarette use among their peers and in their communities through skill-based, developmentally appropriate, and engaging lessons led by college students, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a bit. We also integrate opportunities to get involved and be change makers beyond our school-based lessons. And since February 2019, you'll see a map here that represents the reach across Kentucky that we've had so far. And so far, we've reached over 6,000 Kentucky youth across 20 counties. And we really do take pride in being able to have a conversation with not only the youth directly, but individuals like you who might be working with youth as well. So what makes our program unique? Well, I like to think a lot of different things, but we'll just touch on a couple today. I think the cornerstone of our program is using a tailored peer-to-peer approach to encourage engagement, skill building, and support. And from our own research, as well as emerging research across other states, we know that things like social influences, including friend substance use, and low school connectedness are all predictors of e-cigarette use among youth. So we have to talk about it. We have to figure out a way to target those things. The youth perspective is really critical to tobacco prevention and control because most people do start using before they're 18 years old. And you know, the tobacco industry, which we'll talk a little bit about later, they continue to use advertising strategies and flavors that appeal to youth and the next generation of users. So youth involvement can really help lead to environmental changes, social norm changes, and reduce pro-tobacco influences in their communities. We have an amazing team of college facilitators who help develop and update all of our content, all of the activities that we do in our presentations, and then they are the ones that actually go and deliver our presentations in schools and in the community. And they've really made this program their own, and I couldn't be more proud. Sometimes what we as adults think youth need to know might not always be the hook to engage them. And so our team thinks outside of the box to present the content in ways that really resonate with youth and inspire them to want to make a difference. We want it to feel like a conversation where students have a place to be open, actively learn, and then brainstorm ways they can be involved in the solution to tackle the issue. We know that students want to help, they want to learn, they want to quit if they are using, and they want to get involved. The other thing that we've done with our program is to really try to figure out how can we reach all youth across Kentucky. And so you can see some of our characters there that we developed about a year ago. And we know that e-cigarette use does not discriminate. So we might be talking to the band member, the high school athlete, the students from rural communities, those on the debate team. Those still may be trying to find their place. But we want them to recognize that they're not alone in this. And when we all come together, it makes ending the trend a bit easier. So when developing our program, we wanted to make sure to align with best practices for tobacco prevention, but also the national and state health education standards. And this really helps us be able to get into schools and gain support from the schools that we've already worked with. We have a tailored 1- and 3-lesson option for our school-based programming for late elementary, middle, and high school students. And here you can just see how our curriculum aligns with some of these health education standards. This is specifically for high school students. And within all of our lessons, engaging activities are important. And, you know, we're really able to delve a bit deeper in that 3-lesson session. So we try to get schools to jump on board with that. The other thing that I love about our program is that we're able to review real-time student and teacher feedback through our evaluation efforts, which ultimately helps inform future approaches, but also supporting our trained college facilitators. We also share summary reports with participating schools or partners to help their future efforts. Here you can see an example of a highlight that we include in our shared summary. And I just want to point out there's pretty positive feedback on that highlight summary. Okay, so enough of me talking. To get a true sense of our approach, let's take a peek into what one of our lessons for high school looks like. I'd like to turn it over to Sierra Miley, one of the college students who actually helped develop this program. She served as a college facilitator for a year before taking over as our amazing program coordinator. And she's just going to give you a snapshot of one of our lessons so you can see our approach in action. Take it away, Sierra.
Hi everyone, my name is Sierra Miley and I am a student just like you. Today I am so excited to be able to have a conversation with you as a peer. I ask that you be open and honest, and when we want to talk about, you know, what you already know, things you may not know yet in regards to e-cigarettes, and most importantly, what you can do to reverse this trend. So to begin our conversation, I want to ask you, what is a trend? Yeah, those are good answers. And so just like you said, a trend is something that is popular for a period of time. So what are some examples of trends that maybe have gone and come over the past few years? Yeah, the cinnamon challenge, silly bands, chokers. Right, yeah, and TikTok. And so, how do you think that these things became so popular? In other words, why do you think maybe you participated in them, your friends? Yeah, great answers. I agree. Maybe to be cool, to fit in. I know, I got TikTok because my friends got it, just to have a conversation about it. And so all of those are really good answers. And so I have another question. Do you think that any of the reasons for participating in those trends overlap with the reasons that people your age may pick up the trend of using e-cigarettes? Yeah, why is that so? Boredom, curiosity, maybe your friend just asks you. Yeah, those are really good answers. And so what do you think the big difference here between using, e-cigarettes compared to the trend of TikTok or silly bands? Yeah, exactly. We know that silly bands and TikTok don't lead to disease and health concerns like cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And so, besides these social reasons, why do you think people your age are using? Yeah, your friends are doing it, the flavors. Yeah, maybe you're stressed. Yeah, exactly. Those are really good answers. And we know that people our age are using for several reasons, including stressors, flavors, and a huge reason is that manipulative advertising targeted towards vulnerable groups, including people your age. So when you see these advertisements, what do you see? Yeah, colors, fun. Yeah, exactly. And so if you had to guess, how much would you guess e-cigarette companies spend on advertising per year? $100, a little bit higher. Okay, any other guesses? Yeah, okay, so drum roll, please. So we know that in 2018, e-cigarette companies spent over $110 million. We also know that more than 18 million youth saw e-cigarette advertising in 2016. So that number is likely higher now. Although the use of conventional cigarettes has gone down among youth, these companies are always trying to lure us in. And so if you look closely, you'll see a lot of the things that you mentioned earlier, the flavors, the colors, the fun. Yeah, and so, you can also see, if you look closely, a brand specifically is promoting their device in the middle of a respiratory pandemic. Do you notice any warning labels? Yeah, they're really small, right? Yeah, that's not by accident. And so if they do exist, they are small. And so, these companies are marketing not just through advertisements, but they're also marketing through social media, websites, sporting events, and they're even offering scholarships to people our age. So in addition to advertisements, we also know they're marketing on social media. So how many of you guys have social media? Yeah, me too. My favorite, I think, is Instagram. What are you guys mostly on? Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook. Yeah, exactly. So we know that social media is becoming more and more relevant, especially with people our age. So it makes sense for people to brand through social media. Has anyone heard of the term influencer or knows what it means to be an influencer? Right, yeah, exactly. And so as social media has grown, we know that people have made careers on social media, also known as influencers. And so, which influencers are you guys following? Yeah, exactly. I follow a lot of those health accounts too. And so, tobacco companies have paid influencers who are popular among young people to promote their products on social media sites like Instagram. E-cigarette companies have been paying influencers, and some make up to $42,000 a year. And so these influencers are usually young, they have large social media followings, and often they instruct these influencers not to use hashtag ad or not to use hashtag sponsored, or even the brand name to avoid being caught for influencing us. And so the tobacco industry is ultimately taking the advantage of the fact that we look up to these influencers and they're relying on, you and us to make these things look cool or fun. And so, guess what? Unfortunately, when we get on social media, we're seeing that this is working. And so according to a peer-reviewed journal called Addictive Behaviors, using Snapchat more frequently is associated with higher rates of vaping. Why do you think this is? Yeah, exactly. And so the more you see your friends doing something, the more normal it may seem to you. And so, if you look on the screen here, you'll see that this tweet is promoting and normalizing the use of e-cigarettes, which creates that temptation while also making a joke about nicotine dependence. And so social media allows for the industry to have that widespread advertising at almost no cost. And so by sharing these funny antics and videos, young people have essentially done the advertising for them. I know that I don't want to do that advertising for them, but I do know that when I see these things, maybe they are funny and I maybe not think about liking them. And so it's important for us to recognize this. And so unfortunately, as times change, there are other platforms, like you mentioned earlier, TikTok, that become really popular with us. And so here, I'm going to show you an example of a TikTok normalizing e-cigarettes.
This is my mom's beloved crosswall. Some of them are down, but I also have 56 puff bars, all of them used, of course, because I'm not crazy. So I did what any sane and rational person would do, and I created my own cross. This is also about like 2 times the size of that other guy's cross that's on your For You page. And I decided I was gonna, obviously I had to beat him because I am the true vape god. So there's 56, so in total this costs about $560, so that's crazy. I took down my mom's favorite cross and put mine up. So yeah, I think it looks really great up there. May the power of Christ compel you to be a better vape god than me.
Yeah, so unfortunately, those are all over my timeline. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but what did you think about that? Yeah, it is funny. It is funny. Right. Yeah, so now that we've seen some examples of, things that may be influencing these products, let's think about ways we can influence to not use these products, because we can be influencers too. So if you see on the screen, these are some examples that our team has done. And so, we can also be influencers by posting reasons to quit, or just any information that is being something positive. And so you don't have to give an entire lesson on the history of e-cigarettes by influencing your peers, but you can still be funny and relevant. And so here's an example of our team.
Because it's disrespectful to you. It is disrespectful for one woman. Red. To you. It is disrespectful to you. It is, first of all, it's disrespectful in general to you because it's disrespectful.
Yeah, so that was funny too, right? Yeah, so we can have fun by being influencers too. Okay, so that was a specific example of what our college facilitators would do in the classroom. And so as you could see, I answered a lot of my own questions, but we would technically allow that time for students to respond and engage and provide their own input. And so, as times have changed, we have learned a lot since 2019, and we're always updating our approach as we learn best ways to engage youth. And so one of these, approaches that resonate with you specifically is always asking them what they see first. And so specifically, I remember one of my very first presentations, a student raised his hand and he told us that Juul was no longer in use. And we felt really silly because we knew that Juul was the most popular product on the market at that time. And so we used the term Juul throughout the entire presentation, but ultimately we lost our credibility because we weren't asking them what they were seeing in their own community. We also know that approaches that resonate specifically with health consequences, when we're talking about these health consequences, we know that it's important to note that this is a new product. And so we don't have the same data as we do for cigarettes. But we do know that the FDA has not recommended these devices as a proven way to quit other forms of tobacco. We also know that youth are uniquely at risk to the nicotine exposures since the brain is still developing at age 25. So we know that there are both short and long-term health consequences associated with using these devices, but specifically when we're talking to our students, we've learned that including short-term health consequences and scenarios that make sense in their world has been beneficial. So sometimes when we're thinking about long-term consequences, youth feel invincible or have had a hard time understanding how these relate to their choices today. So for example, when youth hear long-term effects like nicotine dependence, mood disorders, permanently lowering of impulse control, it tends to go over their heads. And so it's more effective for youth to hear about short-term impacts that they can, understand on a day-to-day basis. So for example, when we give students a scenario, we put it into the perspective of, John is having trouble breathing while playing basketball and develops a cough. What may John be experiencing? And, an answer for that may be decreased lung function. We also know, unfortunately, the issue of dependence is very real among youth. And we know that according to our surveys, students know that they want to know they're not alone in this journey. And so testimonials are a really good way for us to connect. But we also know that we're not invincible as young people, and we want our youth to know that as well. And so we also have asked a student from Kentucky specifically to volunteer his time and share his story. And so we do share, this video with our students. And when we talk to youth about addiction and dependence, it's really important for us to stay empathetic, because you never know whether, someone in the audience or one of their friends is using. They may be struggling just a few hours to get through their vape. So it's really important, like Dr. Ngss was saying, to create that open and safe environment for this conversation to be had. Ultimately, we are not there to judge or punish our students. We also know, Kahoot and engagement are really good ways, specifically with virtual learning, but also in the classroom. So due to COVID, a lot of our strategies had to be adapted to fit the needs of reaching our students virtually. But overall, our goal as to engage students has not changed. And so from our feedback surveys directly from students, we know that 89% thought that Kahoot was helpful in keeping them engaged. And the majority of qualitative data does show that students love Kahoots and other activities, including virtual scavenger hunts, PSA development, and then our hairspray activity, where we compare the difference between, what is water vapor and then what is, a type of aerosol. We also know that skill building activities are really important for that hands-on experience. And so each presentation does vary depending on age in terms of language, but also in terms of activities. So although content is similar among all 3 grade levels, we do change those activities. So for example, for our elementary students, we know that decision-making skills are really key for this age group. So we focus for an activity for our elementary students, we focus on teaching those refusal skills. And so compared to high school, we go through an activity where we teach, students, how do you, determine what a credible source is? What is the goal of that source? Is it subjective? Is it objective? That way students can leave our presentations with skill-based opportunities to make informed decisions on their own outside of our presentations. Okay, so we also know that, from our feedback surveys that tobacco prevention is important in regards to many issues, so social justice, environmental factors. And so according to our feedback survey, out of chemicals, health effects, nicotine dependence, secondhand aerosol exposure, we know that for 4th and 5th grade, chemicals specifically resonated the most with this age group compared to high schoolers, while the health effects really resonated with them. Interestingly enough, though, environmental impact is something that we include in our lessons and was the 2nd highest reason among middle school and high schoolers why they choose not to use. The most important point for this slide is the fact that, all of these reasons have really high percentages. And so it's really important for us to maximize our opportunity by including all of these things.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Go ahead.
Thing is just empowering them to end the trend. And so it's not enough just to educate them. It's also really important to be able to instill this empowerment quality in them so they can make decisions for themselves. And so we always ask our students different ways that they can be a part of this movement specifically. And so we have done this for our youth advisory board. And we have a lot of other initiatives where we work with community partners as well beyond youth. So, this really is a team effort.
Thank you so much. Both of these presentations has been fabulous, and we have some great feedback we'll share and questions afterwards. But I wanted to say thank you to Mindy and to Sierra, but we really want to hear from Craig Wilmhoff, lastly, a high school science teacher from Perry County Schools. We're so excited to hear your perspective, Craig.
Hello there, everyone. My name is Craig Wilmhoff. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. I hope it's not blocking anything.
You can see it. Looks good.
All right, good. So what we're going to talk about here, I've actually had the privilege of going through the lessons that Dana and Elise presented in that workshop. And I've had the privilege of going through one of the lessons set up by Sierra and Dr. Ngss. So what we have here is I want to connect what they've been doing with the curriculum standards for these lessons. And what we have is I'm going to go through and show you how they line up with the National Health Education Standards, the Next Generation Science Standards, which is used by pretty much everyone in science, teaching high school science. Also advanced placement, the AP, the ACT, which is always important for students that are going to go to college, and then the K-Prep. A lot of people forget about the K-Prep, but that is actually going to be the testing standard for the state of Kentucky for juniors. So this is going to be a very important thing on how do we link what has been presented here already today to these standards so we can use them in the classroom. Now, the National Health Education Standards. What you have is, here's a link to the CDC website, and I'm going to go through just some of these, but the CDC website is basically the same standards that the state of Kentucky is using for the health education. So anyone teaching health education can use the material presented by Sierra and Dr. Ngss, and they can use that and incorporate their lesson into what they are teaching in the classroom. Now here you can see there's 8 standards, and these are the first 4 for the National Health Education Standards. And all of these are going to be able to be used by a health education teacher. You can see students comprehend concepts related to health promotion and prevention to enhance health. Obviously, that's something that you're going to get out of, like the presentation that Sierra gave you an example of. Standard 2, analyze the influence of family peers. Again, all of these standards are going to be incorporated, especially into what the presentation that Sierra gave. And here is standards 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay. And you can read these, and I'll be more than happy to share this presentation with you and share any links. But you can see all of these all these standards are going to be covered by what they are going over in the presentation for I Can End the Trend. Now, the next one we have is the Next Generation Science Standards. Okay. And the Next Generation Science Standards, I think I just clicked off my slide, this is from a kind of informational sheet from the NGSS website. And it says, what will the NGSS look like in the classroom? Well, obviously, I've highlighted what I thought were the really important parts for this. Hands-on, collaborative, an integrated environment rooted in an inquiry. Inquiry, I thought, was an important word for this, and especially doing the lessons that Dana and Elise have provided. You're going through that scientific inquiry. You're going through and looking at the data and formulating ideas about vaping and the harmful effects of vaping. So you're covering what is in the Next Generation Science Standards. Another thing was it enables students to think, solve, communicate, collaborate. Obviously, as they go through any one of these, whether it is the I Can End the Trend or it's the lessons from Dana and Elise, they're going to have to problem solve. They're going to have to communicate. They're going to have to collaborate and think. So all of these things are covering standards. This was also from the informational kind of pamphlet, kind of flyer, and 3-dimensional learning. Okay, again, I kind of highlighted what I thought was important parts of this. So students' success for 21st century, connect scientific principles to real-world situations. So again, this is vaping. This is real-world as it gets for high school students especially. The next thing we have is the goal of instruction is for students to be able to explain real-world phenomena. They're looking at real-world data. They're looking at this data from these lessons, okay? And they're talking about a real-world activity, the vaping, and the harmful effects of the vaping. Okay. This is specifically from one of the NGSS standards. And this is for middle school. That's the MS over here is for middle school. And these are specific examples that you can incorporate into your lesson plans if you need to. Right? You can conduct an investigation to provide evidence that living things are made of cells, either one cell or a number of different types of cells. Well, obviously, from the presentation and some of the lessons that Dana and Lise have provided, they were specifically looking at cells and the different types of cells and the effect of vaping on these cells. So obviously that is covered. Okay? Use arguments supported by evidence for how the body is a system. We're looking at different systems. We're looking at the immune system, the respiratory system. So that's the interconnections there. This one, again, for the middle school, construct a scientific explanation based on evidence for how environmental and genetic factors interact in organisms. And here we have the environmental. Okay? We have the vaping. That's an environmental toxicant introduced into the body, and they have to come up with scientific explanations. And here's for the high school. Develop and use a model to illustrate hierarchical organization of interacting systems within multicellular organisms. So again, a model, develop a model, and here you have this organization again. And the organization within the body of the respiratory interacting, the organization with the immune system. And then plan and conduct an investigation to provide evidence of feedback mechanisms. So the feedback mechanisms, like what Elise showed with the cilia beating, and that the cilia slowed down, and then all of a sudden, after they removed the vaping material, the cilia recovered. So that is a feedback type mechanism. Now, advanced placement, and I took this directly from one of the support materials from Elise and Dana, and this is for advanced placement. And you can see they have actually outlined for the AP, the advanced placement classes for the life science, and relevant units. Down here you can see all 6 science practices, big ideas for the AP classes. Now, for the ACT. ACT is all about interpretation. All about interpreting graphs, figures, tables. Okay? This is exactly what you're getting at in these lessons. How to interpret scientific data. And what I have here is on the left, this is taken from a practice test for the ACT. And on the right, this is taken directly from Dana and Elise's presentation today. And you can see you are interpreting data. That is preparing students for the ACT. And that is one of the kind of overall guides that the state of Kentucky uses for gauging how well students are doing, is the ACT. So this is very important to incorporate this kind of material into your lessons. And then K-Prep. K-Prep is going to be given this year for juniors, for biology, for the sciences. And what you have is, it is totally different. We used to have, in the sciences, we used to have the EOC tests for the state of Kentucky. And they were based more on content. What the K-Prep is getting away from that. This is taken, this figure over here on the left is taken directly from the K-Prep website, which I have the link up here. It was taken off of that K-Prep website. So that is showing that you are having to interpret data, much like the ACT. And again, this is the, over here on the right is the taken directly from the presentation today by Dana and Elise. Interpretation of data, interpretation, whether, students have to be able to do this. They have to be able to problem solve and interpret data. And by going through these exercises, it's going to help enormously, not just educating them about vaping, but also educating them and meeting your standards, your state standards. Now, this last part, what I did in my classroom is I assigned the digital interactive notebook that Dana and Elise created. And I embedded a Google form at the end of the notebook. I didn't alter the note. That's the only alteration I made to the notebook. And I had my students do it. Now, I had both dual credit students and my general biology students do this interactive notebook. I wanted to get a broad range of students based upon basically academic kind of ability and see how well they did with this. And I asked only 3 questions, 3 very basic questions. And the first one you can see here, was the digital notebook easy to follow and use? And you can see about 60% said it was. And you can see over here that about 21% said it wasn't. And honestly, that's about what I expect, especially when you're including students in a general class. I expected this, and I didn't give them any background information beforehand. So I actually expected this to be a little higher than this. So this is telling me that the digital interactive notebook can be used, especially if you are to preface it beforehand with little information on the respiratory and immune system. I think students would get even more out of it. Okay? So it is, students are able to do it, they are able to use it, you are able to incorporate it into the classroom.
Thank you, Craig, so much. I just wanted to say this was great, as we really wanted to address some of your questions that you've been putting in the chat box. But you're welcome to go ahead and start to fill out the evaluation form. I think Ellen's putting that in the chat using the link. Well, actually the link that's going to be on your screen, I think. And we'll also be sharing it in the chat box. Just as a reminder, 8 of you will win a $25 gift card if you complete the evaluation, and we will notify you of the winners in the next day or 2. I also encourage you to continue typing in your questions. We won't get to all of them today, but we will follow up with an email and provide more information. So if the presenters just want to turn their cameras on for a minute, we do have a couple questions in the chat box. As you're joining us, let me just tell you that some of the audience shared for the Beyond Nicotine program that it was awesome and that they wish science teachers would use real life examples. And then for I Can End the Trend, someone mentioned that they loved the conversational tone and they felt that that was really valuable. And there was a wow with the TikTok. So I just wanted to let you know that. So the 2 questions that we had in the chat box, one was, what is the easier one probably? What is the age or grade level that your program addresses most effectively? So Elise or Dana, do you want to mention which grade?
Yeah, we targeted our lessons, the first 2 especially, at an AP biology classroom. We have had teachers who have used that in non-AP classes, and sometimes they'll remove or add certain questions or certain graphs. But it's definitely targeted at the high school, and even some have been community college teachers that have used it. The digital interactive notebook could maybe even also be for non-AP.
So juniors, seniors, would you say? AP biology, okay, probably seniors. How about the I Can End the Trend?
You're muted, Dana.
I was just going to add another audience that we tried to reach with this 3rd lesson were anatomy and physiology teachers as well as biomedical science teachers. So we tried to make it more applicable to more different disciplines.
Awesome, thank you. How about the I Can End the Trend? What age or grade is really optimal?
I would say that all grades. Like mentioned in the presentation, ultimately our content is similar among 4th through 12th grade, but our approach really resonates very differently for, elementary, middle, and high school. So I would say all grades for sure.
Awesome, thank you. The other question here I want to make sure I get to is for Beyond Nicotine. And the question was, what effect, if any, does your program have on smoking rates among kids in terms of framing it as an environmental question? Do you have any data on that, or do you want to address that question?
No, I mean, we don't have any data on that, in part because we just haven't had the funding to do any kind of follow-up evaluation on. I know, like Craig, I don't know if he shared that slide, but he asked his students if it impacted whether or not they wanted to vape. So I can't remember the exact words. So I think we hope to get some data and some anecdotal, stories from teachers. But yeah, in terms of smoking, we haven't really gone down that path.
Right. Well, the life sciences seems like your goal is, obviously these two programs, extremely valuable, very different, right? The approaches are very different. Yeah. How about I can end the trend in terms of outcomes on use, smoking or vaping? Do you have any data on that?
So we are collecting data. A lot of our first wave of data really focused on process evaluation and trying to figure out what kind of things students really responded to and what they engaged with the most effectively, and did they like college students presenting the content. I think we needed to make sure that approach worked first. We are collecting impact evaluation data, so we have things like self-efficacy to encourage friends to quit. We have intention to use. We also have all tobacco product use, and then attempts at quitting. We're still kind of evaluating what that data look like, because, and this is just a challenge with school-based programming, sometimes to try to get the process in place, it takes a while. And so I think, again, as we're going through our first few years of piloting this program, we've learned that we also need to adapt the evaluation methods. One of the things that we really learned too is when we're working virtually, which this whole past year we had to do all of our presentations virtually. Much larger challenge. You would think it's easy, you just send a link and they complete it, but a lot of students don't have their own email, or they don't have internet access outside of those school hours. And so again, we're reevaluating what our evaluation looks like, but we've seen some positive trends in at least things like self-efficacy and communicating about the issue.
Okay, thank you. And I know we're out of time, you all, but I guess one last, if you guys can keep your answers to kind of one, just a little short. In your opinion, what are the strengths of your approach, and what are the challenges as well? Because both are good. They're just very, very different. So thoughts about that, and chime in, Craig. Maybe we'll start with you. What do you think the strengths and challenges are for each of the approaches?
I think with the lessons provided by Elise and Dana, I think they're great for, like you said, AP level students. I think the challenge is going to be for teachers to incorporate that maybe and make it a little more accessible for the general population. I think, it's not always the case, but I think more of the general population students are going to be the ones smoking and vaping. I think even a little more, at least that's what I noticed in the high school setting. So I think we need to really kind of target those students.
Thank you. Any last thoughts so we can conclude? How about Elise?
Real quick, I was gonna add, I think another challenge from the scientist perspective is that there is a lot we don't know, and we have to be honest about that. And kids, we can't tell them this is horrible. We have to be honest that, it may or may not be. And I think that can get in the way of the prevention message sometimes.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think it makes the topic real by showing real people doing real research, and it reminds them that science is an ongoing process. It's not all in a textbook. And I think a challenge is, training teachers and getting them comfortable with the information so that they can teach it.
Thank you. Last word, Sierra? Mindy?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say, I think our strengths for I Can End the Trend specifically is that peer-to-peer approach and just being able to create that open and honest environment. But beyond that, also instilling skills that are beyond just e-cigarette and peer pressure. So things that they can really use in the real world. And then for challenges, I think, being able to have this conversation with students more than one time or 3 times, depending on that lesson. And then additionally, scheduling with teachers and just making sure that we can really follow up with these students.
Thank you. Well, that was fabulous. And I know it was a quick 75 minutes. So as we continue to get these evaluations in, please go ahead and save the date for our next Kentucky Tobacco Control Conference webinar. I think the link is in your chat. It's coming up on June 1st from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. We will be talking with elected officials about smoke-free policy, and please register for that. And it's on the screen, I believe. Yes. And then next to last is that webinar, as well as the one today, will be sponsored by our friends at UK Healthcare, Kentucky Health Collaborative, the Kentucky Asthma Management Program, and Interact for Health. Thank you so much. We couldn't do this without you. And with that, we leave you today. Thank you so much to our amazing 5 presenters for teaching us so much. We can't wait to share everything we've learned. And of course, thank you to everyone for spending your Tuesday afternoon with us, especially if this was your first time participating in Kentucky Tobacco Control Conference webinars. It is going to take all of us in schools, health departments, policymakers, youth themselves, parents, others working together to end this trend in e-cigarette use. So you'll see on your screen the contact information for Beyond Nicotine and hashtag I Can End the Trend, KTPC, and KCSP. So please take advantage of these resources. We'd love to hear from you. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.